The no side of the referendum question is one that currently in the polls is behind, but the assumption of those who believe that there shouldn't be a voice to Parliament is that there are many people whose minds can be changed. Amongst them, the former Prime Minister, John Howard.
The failure of governments at different levels. Look at the Northern Territory. 15 years ago when I was Prime Minister, we had an intervention in the Northern Territory, and that was because of the failure of the Territory government. In the last few weeks, months, we've seen the same failure, virtually, repeated in the same part of Australia. Now that's a failure of government, and having a voice won't stop that.
Now we know that every institution in the country will be coming out for yes, but there is one bloke who can move the needle when it comes to politics in this country. No need for an introduction. Here's Clive Palmer. Clive, lovely to see you. Firstly, what's your opinion of The Voice as opposed to what your plan is when it comes to the campaign? What's your view of it?
Well, I think every Australian recognises that Aboriginal people should be recognised in our Constitution. That's the first part of what's so-called The Voice we should accept. That's a separate proposition to what the Prime Minister is proposing, and there should be two questions. I think everyone would vote for that. But what you've got to understand is under our Constitution, all Australians, be they black or white, have the same rights. They have the same right to approach the Member of Parliament, to make representations to government, or to commence legal action. Under The Voice, if you're an Indigenous person, you won't have that right anymore. You'll have to go to your committee. When you make a complaint to the public service, they'll say, well, you're an Indigenous person, you go to the committee. That committee may take notice of what you say, it may pass on your representation, or it may do nothing. This is a plan to take from Aboriginal people their voice and their participation in Australian society. And it's based on race, whether you're white or whether you're black. And that's one thing that people like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King and others have given their lives for, and their whole lives, be in prison and incarcerated to guarantee that true racism is destroyed and doesn't form part of government. We can't stop racism, but we can stop the government from legislating against it. So I'm worried about our Indigenous brothers and sisters who have been looked after by committees for years. First, they couldn't, the money they earned in Queensland was sequestered by the government and controlled by a committee. Their travel where they could go, and they were classified as fauna and flora up until 1966. Indigenous people in Australia should have the same rights as white Australians. They don't want to go backwards. They don't want to have their complaints vetted by a committee which may be made up of a select group which is favourable to the government. I know it's convenient for Mr Albanese not to have to face criticism for his failing Aboriginal Indigenous policies, to have them hidden and shielded behind a committee of people, but individual Australian citizens, be they white or black, must have the right to go directly to their members of Parliament, to go directly to the bureaucracy and to put their position for themselves and their families. And we can't take that from our Indigenous brothers and sisters. If we do, we'll regret it.
Those that are in strong advocacy of the Yes movement are starting to move to a stage where we'll break a nation's heart, we'll kill off an Indigenous identity, a whole series of things that have been said from Marsha Langton to Noel Pearson and all in between. What do you say in response to that as somebody who wants recognition, who understands the issue, who wants our Indigenous brothers and sisters to walk amongst us with all equal protections of the law, that no doesn't mean a rejection of that aspiration?
Well, I think the challenge is to the Prime Minister to put the two questions to the Australian people. The first question, that Aboriginal people should be recognised in the Constitution as an historical fact, to put an end to terra nullius, that there were no people living in Australia when there was European settlement, and to recognise that we are all equal and with equal rights under the law, and not to force and make Indigenous people go through a committee to make their commitments. You can imagine making a complaint to a public servant. He'll say, well, you're an Indigenous, madam, you go to your committee, see what they think about it. If they think it's okay, then I can consider it. Well, that's not going to happen to a white Australian. Why are we forcing this handicap on black Australians and pretending that it's a good thing for them? Because the people like that you've mentioned all want to get on the committee. They want to control the Aboriginal community and the voice. They don't want individual Indigenous people to have any rights at all. And I appall that. All Australians should be valued equally. And we should all walk together as Martin Luther King he said across the plains of Georgia when little white children and black children walk together holding hands. And that should be the approach in Australia, that we walk together that we are equal, that no one can take from an Indigenous person their rights and say they have to go through a committee. They're sick of committees. They've had committees for 200 years and they've been abused. And now the Prime Minister Albanese wants to continue that abuse into the next century. It's disgraceful.
The bulk of money that will be donated to the Yes and No campaigns will end up going to the Yes campaign. So here's the obvious. We know that you'll put your money where your mouth is, where your heart is and where you want the country to be. So will you be putting sizable push behind the No campaign?
Well, Paul, governments may rise and fall, but ideas go on forever. And I'll certainly be supporting the idea of freedom and equality in our country, where Indigenous Australians can have the same rights as other Australians. And I'm sure most Australians will come to that position when the truth's known. I challenge Albanese to have a debate with me, to discuss these issues and to be frank and honest with the Australian people. I'm happy to put the case that every Australian should have the same rights, not to handicap our Indigenous community, requiring them to go to a committee to get the stamp of approval before even saying that they've got a valid idea, that they've got the right to protest, that they've got the right to take a legal action. How long are we going to try to supervise individual citizens' families and what they do? And this is what's been going on for years, this Uncle Tom mentality that many Indigenous Australians are clinging to because they want to depend on the government for their welfare. They don't want to stand on their own 2 feet. They're not the average Indigenous Australian. If you talk to people in the outback, far away from Sydney and Melbourne, you'll see they want to protect their rights to be able to live the way they want to live, to be able to think what they think and to make the approaches and representations that they believe are important. They don't want to be filtered and censored by a bureaucratic committee made up of public servants, sponsored by Canberra, who really have no knowledge of their life, their families or what they're facing.
Clive, nice to talk to you. I'm glad we made up. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Paul.
See you
Good
later.
on you. Thanks.
Good on you.
Bye.
Clive Palmer, of course, joining us from Queensland.